There are places so quiet that even your own breathing feels loud. Up in the Alaskan mountains, where the wind speaks more often than people do, there stood a cabin built by a man who had long stopped listening to the noise of the world. His name didn't matter much. Names belonged to town, lists, bank papers. Up here, he was simply the man in the valley, the one with the strange chimney. From a distance, you could see smoke curling from it in odd directions, drifting not straight up like the others, but swirling low, dancing close to the roof as if reluctant to leave. The locals who came by for trade or curiosity used to call it stupid, a crooked pipe. They laughed at how it leaned sideways, how it bent, turned like something patched together without sense. But when the deep cold came, the kind that makes metal crack and dogs curl tight in their fur, that same stupid chimney kept his cabin 60 degrees warmer than any other in the valley. The man had built his home by hand, the way old men used to do before blueprints and building codes decided what was. He had found the logs himself, chosen each one for how it rang when struck, how it smelled when cut. The mountain had given him wood and stone and silence, and in return he gave it labor and gratitude. There was no electricity here, no hum of wires, no glow of screens to mark the hour, only the rhythm of fire, frost. In that rhythm, the man had found a kind of peace most people only remember in dreams. But what fascinated those few who still spoke of was Chimney, the one that looked wrong but worked better than all the rest. He had not built it crooked out of ignorance. He had done it because he had watched the wind. For years before he settled here, he had camped in these same mountains, mapping where the snow piled deep and where the gusts carried heat or cold. He had noticed how smoke from campfires moved differently. The air was heavy, how it clung to the ground when the sky was clear and the stars hard as nails. When the time came to build his permanent shelter, he remembered every curl of that smoke, every sigh of wind that twisted through the valley. And so he angled the chimney, not to defy the rules of builders, but to obey the mountain. The first winter after he built it, temperatures fell to 40 below. The creeks froze solid. Even the wolves moved lower toward the tree line where the wind bit less. His nearest neighbors, if you could call them that since each cabin sat miles apart, found their walls crusted with frost. They burned twice the wood he did, and still their breath hung like ghosts inside. But in his cabin, you could sit without gloves, watch the frost form outside the window while your hands stayed warm enough to carve or write. The air moved gently through the room, never choking the fire, never letting it die. The secret was not in the wood or the stove, but in the way the air flowed through his crooked pipe, circulating warmth instead of wasting it. When visitors came, hunters, trappers, sometimes a lost traveler, they always asked about it, why the chimney leaned, why he hadn't built it straight like any sensible man would. He would only smile and say, because straight lines don't belong to the wind. That answer never satisfied, of course. People want rules, not riddles. They want to be told what to do, not what to watch. Yet, if you stayed long enough, you'd begin to understand what he meant. The mountain has its own logic. It's not written in books or measured in degrees. It's seen in how the snow drifts, how a raven rides the air, how smoke bends and returns before vanishing. The man had simply listened, but there was more to that chimney than physics and wind. It was a reflection of the man himself, crooked in the eyes of others, perfectly aligned with the truth he had come to know. His neighbors built their lives straight and square, following the same blueprints they had learned from fathers and manuals. He built his by intuition, by the feel of things, and so his home became an extension of his soul, imperfect to the eye, but wide its function. He would often sit by the fire, watching how the heat shifted through the room, how it wrapped around his chair and the tools hanging near the wall. It pleased him not just because it was warm, because it worked in harmony with the world outside. That was the beauty of it. He didn't conquer the cold, he befriended it. Many winters later, the valley grew quieter. Fewer people stayed. Those who could left for towns with easier comfort. The few who remained still spoke of the man with the bent chimney, though they didn't see him often. Sometimes smoke still rose from his cabin in the early dawn, a sign that he was alive and tending his fire. Sometimes it didn't, and they wondered if the cold had finally taken. But then days later, a thin spiral would rise again, that same swirling motion against the pale sky, as if reminding the mountain the old still breathed. If you ever found yourself standing before his cabin, you'd notice how everything about it seemed to blend with the land. The logs had aged to the same gray as the rocks nearby. The roof was crusted with moss and lichen, and the windows, small and deep-set, reflected only the forest. The door creaked in a voice that sounded almost human. Inside, it smelled of smoke, pine, and something older, perhaps patient. His tools hung in quiet rows, each one shaped by use rather than design. Nothing was new, yet everything worked. The stove, though patched, scarred by years of fire, still burned clean and steady. The chimney above it curved like a question mark through the wall, leading the smoke on its peculiar path to the open air. It was the kind of thing that made you stop and think, maybe the man wasn't a strange one after all. Maybe everyone else was. I remember once when a traveler from Anchorage visited him in late spring, bringing supplies and a curious mind. The young man had studied engineering and thought he'd impress the old hermit with talk of heat efficiency and draft pressure. He brought a notebook, measuring instruments, even a little wind gauge. He asked to examine the chimney, to take notes, to maybe write about it later. The old man laughed and said, "You can measure it all you want, but you'll never understand it if you don't sit still." The visitor didn't know what to make of that, but after spending 3 days there, sleeping by that steady warmth, watching the smoke's lazy dance, he closed his notebook and said nothing more. Some truths don't fit into diagram. They live in the space between observation and understanding. Patient. The mountain winters are long. There's a kind of silence that seeps into you, slow as snow piling on the roof. At first, it's unnerving. The absence of voices, but then you start to hear other things, the creak of trees in frost, the sigh of the fire when a log shifts, the heartbeat of the land itself. The old man had learned to hear those sounds like language. That's how he knew when a storm was coming or when the ice in the creek was ready to break. That's how he knew how to shape his chimney to speak back to the mountain in its own tongue. Maybe that's what people forget in the towns below, that nature isn't something to fight or fix, but something to listen to. The mountain will always tell you what it needs if you stay quiet long enough. It's strange how one crooked piece of metal could hold so much meaning, but up here, small things become symbols. That chimney was a lesson about humility and observation. It reminded anyone who saw it that wisdom doesn't come from doing things the way they're supposed to be done, but from understanding why they should be done at all. The man never wrote about his invention. He never tried to patent it or name it. He just lived with it, content it worked. Sometimes, in the evenings, he'd sit by the fire and look up at smoke slipping through the stovepipe, his eyes following the faint trail as if watching a story leave the room. Perhaps he saw in it the reflection of his own life, simple, unseen, but moving with purpose through the cold air. If you ever find yourself drawn to the quiet, to the thought of living where only your own voice answers back, maybe you'd understand a little of it. It isn't about escaping the world, it's about hearing it more clearly, stripped of its noise. And if you ever build something of your own, a cabin, a life, a dream, maybe you'll remember his chimney, that stubborn, beautiful mistake that wasn't a mistake at all. Because sometimes the things that look foolish to others are the only things that truly work in harmony with the life to live. And if you've been listening so far, tell me, where are you hearing this story from? Somewhere cold like his mountains, or from a warm place far away? I'd like to know, because stories like this always sound different depending on where the listener sits. Before he ever built that cabin, before the chimney and the solitude, the man had lived in a world that spoke too loudly and listened too little. He had been like anyone else once, walking city streets, paying bills, chasing appointments, smiling in rooms where his heart wasn't present. He had worked with his hands even then, though not with wood or stone. Back in those years, his tools were made of steel and glass, the kind used in fine mechanical. He had been an instrument maker, crafting things that required patient precision. But over time, the rhythm of his craft swallowed by the speed of everything around him. Orders came faster, deadlines grew tighter, and the silence he once needed to work was replaced by the constant hum of machines, phones, and other people's voices. It wasn't one single moment that drove him away. It was the slow accumulation of noise, the erosion of stillness, until he could no longer hear his own thought. He used to come home from work and sit in the dark, waiting for his ears to stop ringing, not from sound, the absence of. His hands, once steady and sure, began to tremble with a restlessness that no rest could fix. He thought maybe he needed company, so he tried that too. Friends, gatherings, laughter over meals. But every time he returned home, the same weight settled back over him, heavier than before. People said he was quiet, too quiet, that he needed to get out more. What they didn't understand was that he had already been too far out, pulled away from something essential inside him. He didn't need more noise. He needed space to remember what silence sounded like. There had been a woman once. She was kind, steady, and believed that love could cure whatever haunted him. They built a life together in a small house near the edge of town, planted a garden, planned for children they never had. For a while, he tried to believe in the comfort of ordinary days, but the stillness he needed was not the kind he offered. Hers was the stillness of a home after dinner, a lamp turned low, a quiet conversation. His was the stillness of vastness, the kind found in mountains where silence has weight and cold air strips you clean of pretense. He didn't realize it then, but he was already listening for something the world couldn't give him. When she finally left, she didn't do it in anger. She just said, "You're already gone." And she was right. His body had stayed, but his spirit had drifted toward the high places he had seen only in dreams. The years that followed were slow and gray. He sold his tools, closed his shop, and moved through life like a man underwater. Then one winter, he took a trip north, just to clear his mind, he told himself. But the moment he stepped off the small plane in Alaska and felt the cold bite into his skin, something inside him stirred. The air smelled of pine and distance. The mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks hidden by clouds that moved like living things. He stayed in a small town, the edge of a river, helping a local logger repair his tools in exchange for a place to sleep. He thought it would be for a week. It became a month and a season, and by the time spring melted the ice, he knew he would never go back. He bought a small plot of land deep in the far from any road that stayed open in winter. People told him he was crazy, that no one lived out there full time. But he wasn't looking for company or comfort. He wanted to find out if he could live without the noise, without the rush, without the need to explain himself. He built a tent first, then a rough shelter of log, then the cabin that would become his home. Every piece of it was shaped by his hands and his learning. He made mistakes, dozens of them, but he learned faster than he failed. The mountain taught him through hunger, cold, and the slowness of solving each problem the land provided. The first winter nearly broke him. The cold was not just cold, it was a force, a living thing that crept into every crack and every thought. Firewood burned faster than he could cut it. Frost formed inside his boots. He woke some nights unsure if he'd make it till morning. But then something shifted. Instead of fighting the mountain, he began to listen to. He noticed how the snow piled differently near certain slopes, how the sun hit its cabin at specific hours, how the wind whistled through the gaps like a teacher correcting a student, and in that slow, humbling process, he found what he hadn't even known he was seeking. Clarity, not peace that comes from comfort, but peace that comes. He stopped measuring days by dates and started measuring them by the angle of light on the ridge. He no longer counted time by hours, but by the slow rhythm of his chores, chopping wood, melting snow for water, tending the fire, checking the traps. In the absence of noise, he rediscovered the sound of his own breathing, the steady pulse of his existence. He learned to cook with simplicity, to mend his clothes with patience, to read the weather from the sky. What began as survival became understanding. The mountain was not cruel. It was honest. It gave exactly what was earned. Sometimes, no less. He thought of the world he had left behind. He pictured the people rushing through their days, the endless motion that left no space for stillness. He didn't feel bitterness, only distant. It was as if he had lived another life entirely, one that now belonged to someone else. Letters came at first from old friends, from the woman who had once loved him. They asked as well if he was lonely. He wrote back for a while, explaining in few words that he was fine, that he had found something he couldn't quite name. Eventually, the letters stopped. He didn't mind. He had learned that silence could hold more truth than any sentence. There were moments, of course, when loneliness brushed against, not as pain, recognition. On long winter nights, he would sit by the stove and think of the human warmth he had once known. He would remember laughter, voices, the faint clinking of dishes. But then he would hear the wind rise outside, sweeping over the roof, and feel an odd comfort in its wild. It reminded him that he was part of something vast, something alive and ungoverned. The solitude didn't erase his humanity. It revealed it in its simplest form. He was not lonely. He was complete. The chimney, that bent and beautiful mistake, came later, born from his second winter when he realized that survival wasn't enough. He wanted to live with wisdom, not just endurance. He had watched how smoke trapped in still air wasted heat, how drafts carried warmth away before it could settle. He spent weeks studying the patterns of wind around his cabin, marking where snow gathered and where it never stayed. And then he built his chimney, crooked as instinct, true as reason. When it worked, he laughed aloud. An honest, unguarded startled the quiet. For the first time in years, he felt not just alive, but right. The mountain changed him in other ways, too. His face weathered, his hands thickened, but his eyes grew softer, not harder. He stopped rushing, stopped worrying about what came next. He learned that most things in life don't need to be solved. They just need to be understood. When spring returned each year, he walked the valley barefoot in the thawing mud, feeling the earth wake beneath him. He learned the calls of birds by heart, the tracks of foxes and moose, the way light glowed through thin ice at dawn. Every detail of the world became a conversation, and in those quiet exchanges he rediscovered wonder. To those who knew of him, he was a mystery, a man who had vanished from civilization to live alone among the peaks. Some imagined he was hiding maybe from guilt or loss, but he wasn't hiding. He was returning to the original rhythm of things, where time moved with seasons, silence, emptiness, presence. His life was not an escape from the world. It was an embrace of it in its truest form. If you've ever felt that pull, the ache for stillness, the longing to step away from the endless noise, you might understand him a little. The mountain isn't for everyone, but the need it answers lives in many hearts. The need to remember that being alive isn't the same as being busy, that peace isn't given. It's earned through quiet persistence. That love, even when lost, can change shape and still guide you home. And if you're hearing this now, if his story has stirred something small and steady inside you, maybe it's worth keeping that spark alive. Sometimes the world teaches you through noise, sometimes silence. He found his lesson in the snow and the smoke. You might find yours somewhere else. If you haven't already, stay close to this story. There's more to come. And if you want to keep walking beside this man in the mountains, following his journey of discovery and meaning, you can stay with us as we climb further into his solitude. He woke with the light, not because he had to, but because the mountain told him to. In summer, that meant the faint glow of dawn creeping over the ridge just at 3 in the morning, spilling across. In winter, it meant the slow blue dimness that came late, when the sun was too weary to rise above the peak. His body no longer kept time by clock, only by the color of the light filtered through his small. He would sit up slowly, breathe the cold air that always found a way in. Listen, the mountain always made a sound, even in its stillness, a distant cracking of a gust of wind curling through the trees, the soft hiss of his own breath in the quiet room. He had learned to hear those things as one hears language, not just with the ears, but with tension. There was no hurry in his morning. He would move to the stove, feel the chill of metal under his hand, and begin the ritual of building. Each step mattered. The placement of tinder, the angle of the wood, the way the air should move through the gaps. Fire was not just warmth, it was conversation. If you listened right, it told you how it wanted to burn. When the first flames caught, the smell of smoke filled the cabin, not the sharp bite of new fire, familiar, earthy scent that told him he was still home. He would sit by it, not to worship the flame, but to remember what it meant to be patient. Only after the stove began to hum with steady heat would he boil water, brew his simple coffee, and begin the day. The silence wasn't empty, it was alive. Outside, snow fell without sound, foxes moved unseen, and the creek under its crust of ice whispered faintly like a secret. He would step out of the cabin, his boots crunching in the snow, and the cold would strike him clean. The first breath always felt like baptism, a reminder that he was still of flesh and spirit. Sometimes he spoke aloud, not to anyone, but to the day itself. Just a few words of greeting, soft acknowledgement that he and the mountain shared the morning. He never felt alone doing that. The silence answered in its own way, through the wind, through the creak of the trees, through the shifting cloud. After a while, you stop expecting words and start hearing meaning. His work was never hurried, because there was no one to hurry him. He chopped wood not as a chore, but as rhythm. The steady swing of the axe, the crack of splitting grain, the scent of sap in the air, these things grounded him. He fixed what needed fixing, built what needed building. There was always something to tend, a fence post leaning, a patch of roof to mend, a snare to reset. But unlike the labor of his old life, each task here had purpose clear as daylight. Every movement had weight. He no longer worked to earn time. He worked to fill it with meaning. When his hands grew tired, he stopped. When hunger came, he ate. That was all. Meals were simple. Fish from the stream, roots gathered in autumn, meat from the traps he set with care. He never took more than he needed. The mountain taught balance that way. You couldn't take without giving. Not out here. When he hunted, he did it with quiet respect, thanking the life he took. That might sound foolish to some, but in the deep silence of the valley, you begin to understand that gratitude is not a gesture. It's survival of the spirit. He used every part of what he caught. Fur for warmth, bones for tools, meat smoked and stored. Waste had no place in his world. As the seasons turned, he became part of their rhythm. In spring, he planted small things in a patch of thawed soil, wild greens, hardy vegetables that didn't mind the chill. In summer, he repaired, harvested, walked far. The mountain bloomed with color then, brief, fierce. He would climb high ridges, not to conquer them, but to see the world from above, to remember how vast it was. In autumn, he gathered what the land offered, berries, roots, wood for winter. Each leaf that fell reminded him that time was moving, but not in winter. Listening to the snow's language, living close, there was beauty in every season's demand. Out there, every day was earned, every comfort meant. There were no mirrors. He didn't need to see his face to know who he was. Years of solitude had changed him in ways no reflection could capture. His voice had grown soft, as if shaped by the wind. His eyes carried a calm that only comes when there's nothing left to prove. He had stopped thinking of his solitude as a condition to endure. It was simply his way of being. The mountain didn't judge, didn't question, didn't compare. It just existed, and in that existence, he found permission to do the same. Sometimes the nights were long and brutal, the kind of cold that feels ancient, pressing from all sides, reminding you how small you are. Those nights tested him. The fire would dim, and the shadows grew heavy. But even then, he never felt fear. He'd sit close to the stove, wrapped in a blanket made from fur he'd tanned himself, and watch the glow fade and return with each breath of wind through the... He trusted the mountain himself. That trust was his true shelter. Once, during a storm that lasted 3 days, snow buried half the cabin. He couldn't see the sky or hear the river. The world had become white silence. He could have panicked, many would have, but instead he sat and listened to the storm's voice, deep and endless. He spoke to it softly as one might speak to an old friend, saying, "I hear you." When the storm passed, he dug himself out slowly, laughing as he broke through the final crust of snow into sunlight. That laughter echoed off the cliffs, startling a flock of birds into flight. It was a sound that belonged there. There were visits, rarely. A trapper passing through, a hiker lost off the trail, a pilot dropping supplies once or twice a year. They came curious, sometimes pitying, sometimes admiring. Most couldn't stay long. The silence settled them. They'd ask how he managed to live like that, what he did for company. He'd smile and say, "I listen." They would nod politely, not understanding. How could they? Silence in the city means absence. Silence here means fullness. He never tried to explain it more than that. You can't teach, can only be experienced. In time, the animals became his quiet neighbors. He knew the fox that passed near his cabin each dusk, the owl that perched on the same branch every night, the bear whose prints appeared after the first thaw each year. They were not pets, not companions, but present. He moved through the forest as they did, careful and respectful. Sometimes he'd sit for hours watching a moose feed by the creek, both of them aware of the other, neither afraid. There was an understanding there that all beings shared the same fragile thread of survival, the same hunger for life. That awareness bound him to them more deeply than words could. The days grew into years, but he never counted. Time had softened, become circular rather than straight. Each sunrise its own reward, each sunset its own peace. He began to write small things, not stories, not letters, just thoughts carved into bits of wood or etched onto scraps of bark. Reflection, fragments of feeling. He never kept them organized. Some he burned in the fire, letting the smoke carry his words into the others he left hidden in places only he would find, under stones, inside trees, tucked behind the shelves. They weren't meant for anyone else. They were his way of speaking to the mountain, of saying thank you. When sickness came, and it always did at least once each winter, he endured it with the same patience. Fever, aches, weakness. The fire would burn lower than his strength, thinner each day. But he trusted that too. He knew that healing was not just medicine, but surrender. The mountain never promised him safety, only meaning. He accepted both its kindness and its cruelty as parts of the same truth. And each time he recovered, he felt a little older, a little wiser, and somehow lighter. There was peace in knowing that nothing out there belonged to him, not the land, not the animals, not even the cabin, really. He was only borrowing space, tending them. That humility shaped everything he did. It's easy to believe that solitude makes a man proud, but it does the opposite. It breaks pride into understanding. When you live years surrounded only by nature, you realize how small you are and how large the world truly is. That realization isn't frightening, it's freeing. And so, life in silence became not a pause between moments, but the moment itself, a continuous thread of awareness woven through firelight, snowfall, hunger, sleep, and wait. It was a life stripped down to its essence, where every breath felt earned and every sound carried meaning. There was no past to mourn, no future, only the present, vast, patient, like the mountain itself. Sometimes, late at night, he would step outside and look at the stars. The sky in the valley was so clear it felt close enough to touch. He would stand there for long minutes, feeling the cold seep his bones, watching his breath fade into the... And he would think how strange it was that he had once lived surrounded by millions of people and never felt truly seen. Yet here, under a sky of silent fire, he felt perfectly understood. It began with a sound didn't belong. After years of living in the valley, he knew every whisper of the wind, every creak of wood, every rustle of snow underfoot. But this was different. A low, distant hum that came one late autumn afternoon, faint at first, then growing steadily. He stepped outside, the air sharp with cold, and listened. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't the groan of shifting ice. It was something mechanical, something man-made. For a moment, the memory of his old life flickered. Engines, generators, the steady buzz of civilization. He hadn't heard a sound like that in years. As he watched the sky, a small plane came into view, flying lower than usual. It circled once over the valley, dipped its wings, and disappeared behind the ridge. Moments later came a dull thud, followed by silence. He stood still, the kind of stillness that comes when instinct tells you the world has just changed. He knew what that sound meant. Without thinking, he packed a small bag, rope, fire starter, a bit of food, and began walking toward the ridge. The climb took hours. The snow was deep and crusted, the wind rising as the day dimmed. Each step reminded him how far he was from any help but his own. When he reached the crest, he saw the broken plane resting at the edge of a frozen lake, one wing buried in snow. The smell of fuel lingered faintly in the air. He moved closer, calling out. No answer. Then, near the shattered door, he saw movement. A man, bloodied but breathing, trying to pull himself free. Without hesitation, the hermit moved faster than his years should have allowed. He dragged the pilot clear, checked for broken bones, wrapped him in his coat. The man was half-conscious, mumbling something about radio signals and wrong bearings. The hermit said little. He built a fire right there on the ice's edge, using dry kindling from his pack, coaxing flame from the cold with practiced hand. Heat, light, life, all born from patience. When the pilot's shivering eased, the hermit said, "We'll go to my cabin. It's not far." He didn't say that in these mountains. Not far still meant hours of walking. They moved slowly through the dark, guided by instinct and moonlight. The injured man stumbled often, leaning on the hermit's shoulder. By the time they reached the cabin, both were exhausted. The hermit stoked the stove high, melting snow for water, preparing broth from dried meat. The pilot fell asleep almost instantly, his body surrendering to warmth and safety. The hermit sat beside him, silent, watching the firelight flicker across the strangers. It had been years since another human had slept under his roof. In the following days, as the pilot recovered, the cabin that had been so still for so long filled with unfamiliar sounds, coughing, movement, speech. The man had forgotten how voices changed the air. At first it felt intrusive, but then the stranger grew stronger. A kind of rhythm formed between them. The pilot, who said his name was Thomas, was young, maybe in his early 30s. He had been delivering supplies to a research outpost when a sudden storm forced him off course. He asked how long the hermit had lived there, why he chose such a... The hermit only smiled and said, Because the mountain makes sense to me." Thomas laughed, thinking it a joke. But after a few days, he stopped laughing. He began to watch the old man's movement, the deliberate calm with which he chopped wood, tended the stove, gathered snow for water. There was no rush in him, no hesitation, no complaint. Everything he did seemed part of a pattern, a quiet agreement between him and the world. One night, when the wind howled outside and the chimney breathed warmth into every corner of the cabin, Thomas said, "I don't know how you stand the silence." The hermit answered, "It's not silent. You just haven't learned to hear it yet." In the days that followed, the two men talked little. Quiet understanding grew between them. Thomas began to help, hauling wood, cleaning snow from the roof, learning how the stove's crooked chimney worked. He was fascinated. "It's the strangest design I've ever seen," he said one evening, "but it keeps this place warmer than anything I've built." The hermit nodded. "Because it listens," he said simply. Thomas frowned, unsure if he meant the pipe or the man himself. But as the days passed, he began to feel it too, the sense that everything in the cabin, from the fire to the airflow, moved with intention, as if the place were alive. The storm that had brought Thomas down returned with force a week later. Snow fell so thick that even the nearest trees vanished in white haze. The wind screamed like something ancient, angry. For 3 days they were trapped inside, listening to the world erase itself beyond the walls. The hermit taught Thomas how to judge the fire's health by its sound, how to let the chimney draw just enough air to keep it breathing. They sat for hours in the dim light, sharing stories of their past lives, the old man speaking softly of the years before the mountain, the younger one confessing how he had grown tired of his own kind of noise. Two lives, separated by decades, suddenly mirrored in their longing for stillness. On the 4th day, the storm eased. Thomas wanted to hike back to the crash site, to recover what he could. The hermit agreed to guide him. The journey was slow, the snow waist-deep in places, the air thin. When they reached the frozen lake, they found the wreck buried and still. As they worked to uncover a few supplies, the ice beneath them groaned. The hermit stopped instantly. He knew that sound, a warning. "We have to go," he said. But Thomas didn't listen at first. He wanted his radio, his map. The ice cracked again, sharp and deep. Then the surface gave way. In a blur of motion, the hermit lunged forward, grabbing Thomas's coat as the younger man plunged through the ice. The cold swallowed him in an instant. The old man held tight, bracing his feet against the edge, pulling with every ounce of strength left in him. The wind tore at them both, and the lake roared beneath. Somehow he hauled Thomas free, dragging him to the shore, rolling him onto the snow. The pilot gasped, coughing water, his body shaking uncontrollably. The hermit tore off his own coat, wrapped him, and started a fire with trembling hands. It took hours before Thomas's color returned. Neither spoke much. There was no need. They had both seen how close the mountain had come to taking one of them. That night, as Thomas slept, the hermit sat by the fire, staring at the crooked chimney. Smoke rose in its familiar dance, steady and sure. He realized something he hadn't before, that all his years of solitude, all his careful listening, prepared him for this moment. The mountain had taught him patience, endurance, awareness. Now that knowledge saved another life. It wasn't a miracle, just the simple wisdom of attention. The discovery humbled him. For the first time in a long while, he felt not alone in his understanding, but part of something large, the endless exchange between learning and giving. When the weather cleared, a rescue team finally arrived, following the faint signal from the wreck's beacon. Thomas was weak but alive. He thanked the hermit again and again, promising to return, to bring supplies, to tell others about him. The old man only smiled. "Tell them whatever you like," he said, "but Don't tell him how to find me." They shook hands before the helicopter carried Thomas away, the sound of its rotors echoing through the valley like a memory of another world. When silence returned, the hermit felt not emptiness, but peace. The mountain had taken something from him and given something greater back, the proof that even in solitude, his life touched. After that day, he felt the air move differently through the cabin. The warmth seemed deeper, the silence. He would sometimes catch himself looking toward the ridge, half expecting to see the plane's shadow again. He didn't, but the experience left a mark. Not fear, not regret, but gratitude. It reminded him that life, even in isolation, is never truly separate. Every act of patience, every choice to listen instead of speak, every fire tended in the cold, all of it ripples outward, unseen. As the seasons turned once more, the hermit continued as before, chopping wood, mending tools, walking the snowbound. But now, when he looked at Crooked Chimney and saw the smoke curve and dance, he thought of how it had warmed not just him, but another's. The mountain had given him wisdom. The challenge had given him purpose. He had built a life that seemed small to others, vast in meaning. And through that strange twisting, the one everyone had foolish, he had discovered power of imperfection. Sometimes, when the night grew still and the fire burned low, he would whisper toward the stove, not as a prayer, but as a promise. Everything the mountain takes, it gives back in another form. And the chimney, breathing softly in rhythm with the wind, seemed to answer in return. And if you've been listening to his story, if you've felt the pull of that crooked chimney, the way it defies reason yet holds wisdom, stay close to it. There's more ahead. If you haven't yet, follow this journey, because the next part reveals what solitude really teaches, not just about survival, but about the world we've left behind and the truths we carry within. Years passed, though he didn't keep count. Seasons folded into one another like pages worn by use. The mountains didn't change much, but he did. Age had crept into his bones without warning. His hair turned white like frost, his movements slower, his eye deeper. Yet he did not see those things as lost. He saw them as markings of time well spent, proof that he had lived in rhythm with the land. The world below, he imagined, had continued its restless spin. New machines, new screens, new voices rising to fill the space that silence once held. Sometimes he thought of it with sadness, but mostly distant, as one might recall a place that had been important in another life, now existed only in memory. He often sat by the window when the evenings grew long, watching the shadows stretch across the valley. From that window, he could see the tops of the spruce trees, the bend of the frozen creek, the same ridge where the plane had gone down years before. Everything that mattered was within that. He didn't need more. Each shape, each sound, each change of light spoke of continuity. The mountain didn't judge time, men did. It measured existence, patience, in how snow melted, how roots dug deeper, how rivers carved stone. That patience had become part of him. Sometimes he would think about what it meant to live apart from others for so long. People assume solitude hardens, makes him strange, bitter. But he had learned that true solitude doesn't isolate. It clarifies. It strips away what is unnecessary, leaving only what endures. In the silence, he had faced himself without distraction, his regrets, his fears, his memories, until they lost their shape, became softer, smaller, almost kind. He no longer carried the weight of old mistakes. The mountain had absorbed them, weathered them down like stones smoothed by rain. What remained was understanding. He saw now that the world he had left behind was not wrong, only lost in its own noise. He remembered once hearing a saying before he came north, that men go into the wild to find them. He used to think that meant adventure, discovery, survival, but now he knew it meant something quiet. You don't find yourself by seeking, you find yourself by listening. The self isn't a goal to reach, but a voice to hear beneath the noise of everything else. The mountain had been his teacher, in that. Every storm, every sunrise, every failure had been part of the lesson. Even the crooked chimney had been a kind of philosophy, a reminder that what looks imperfect can still be true if it follows the shape of nature. There were times he wondered what people were chasing down there in this. He had read enough before leaving to know how quickly things change. He imagined faces lit by artificial light, hands busy on glowing screens, voices overlapping in rooms without silence. He tried to picture what they were searching for, meaning connection, proof that they existed. He felt compassion for them, not pity. He understood that same hunger. He had carried it once himself, until he learned that meaning isn't found in movement, but in stillness. The problem wasn't that people had forgotten how to live, it was that they had forgotten how to be. When he thought of the younger man he had rescued, Thomas, he smiled faintly. He had never returned, though sometimes a small plane flew high over the valley in summer, and he wondered if it was him. Maybe Thomas had gone back to his own world changed, or maybe he had told the story and been disbelieved. It didn't matter. The mountain doesn't keep accounts of gratitude. It simply gives and takes in equal measure. What mattered was that for a short time their paths had crossed, and something had been shared, something wordless but real. That was enough. As the years deepened, he began to feel his connection to the land grow more intricate, almost sacred. He no longer felt like an inhabitant of the mountain, but a continuation of. His body worked like the season, slow in winter, eager in spring, steady in summer, reflective in autumn. He could sense storms before they arrived, feel the subtle shift in pressure that meant snow was coming. The birds' calls told him when to gather, when to rest. His senses had become instruments of the environment, tuned by time and attention. It wasn't mysticism. It was awareness, the kind that comes only after years of listening without interruption. Sometimes, during those long nights when the aurora rippled across the sky, he would sit outside wrapped, watch the lights move, green and violet waves dancing soundless the stars. He thought of all the people below who might never see such things, too far, too surrounded by brightness to notice the beauty of darkness. He pitied not their ignorance, but their distance from wonder. To live without wonder, he thought, is the real. The mountain, for all its coldness, never stopped offering wonder. In the way frost caught the moonlight, in the slow birth of dawn after months of shadow, in the heartbeat silence before a snowfall began. Those small miracles filled him more than any luxury could have. He often thought of his younger self, the one who had fled the city with trembling hands and restless thoughts. What would that man think of who he had become? He smiled. The younger him would not have understood. He would have called it loneliness or madness or retreat. But the truth is simpler. Solitude doesn't remove you from life. It places you within it fully. Without distraction, you feel every breath, every ache, every joy. You see the thread that connects you to the wind, the soil, the star. You stop trying to be separate. You realize you were never alone to begin with. One evening, the fire dimmed, the last light faded from the sky. He whispered to himself, everything lives in a circle. It was something he had come to believe deeply. The smoke from his chimney rose, turned, and fell again. Snow. The trees that burned in his stove fed the soil for new growth. Even his breath, leaving his body in small clouds of warmth, would one day return as part of another's air. Nothing was ever lost, only change. The thought comforted him more than any promise. He began to write again, this time more deliberately. Short reflections, scraps of paper, bits of cloth, even carved into wood. Thoughts, silence, patience, and the strange gentleness of hardship. He didn't intend for anyone to read them, but sometimes he imagined a traveler stumbling upon them long after he was gone. Someone tired, someone searching, finding a line that said something simple like, peace is not the absence of struggle. It's the trust that struggle has meaning. He liked that wisdom, once found, might outlive the finder. In his quieter moments, he reflected on the difference between the world of men and the world of mountains. Men build to control, mountains endure to remind. Every invention, every comfort, every achievement seemed to him like a man's attempt to escape his own smallness. But smallness wasn't a flaw. It was the truth. The mountain doesn't apologize for being vast, and the man doesn't need to apologize for being small. They balance each other. The world below chased permanence through progress. Up here, he had found it in impermanence, in things that changed, decayed, and began again. He often wondered what it would feel like to leave the mountain now, to return to where people lived close but felt distant. The thought no longer frightened or tempted him. He knew he wouldn't belong there anymore, not because he rejected, but because he had become part of something slower, older, quiet. The pulse of the mountain had replaced the rhythm of the world, and that when storms came now, he didn't brace himself as he once did. He welcomed them. They were reminders that nothing stands still forever. When his fire burned low, he let it dim before feeding it again. When tools broke, he fixed them calmly. When hunger came, he ate without complaint. His life had become so simple it was almost invisible. Yet within that simplicity, everything important had found its place. He realized then that the greatest discovery of his solitude wasn't how to survive, but how to live gently, to move through the world without taking more than necessary, to let things be what they are, to find meaning in what most people overlook. And in that understanding, he began to feel something close to forgiveness, not toward anyone specific, but toward the noise of the world. He no longer resented it. He saw now that even chaos has its place. Without noise, he would never have learned the value of silence. Without the crowd, he would never have learned the grace of solitude. The world had given him its lesson in its own way, and he had accepted it in his. Sometimes he would look at his chimney, still leaning awkwardly, still breathing warmth into the cabin, smile. It was a perfect metaphor for everything he'd learned, that wisdom often wears of imperfection, that harmony is not found in straight lines, in the curve follow nature's will. The chimney had taught him more about life than any book ever could. It was his teacher, his reminder, his mirror. And if you've listened this far, if the old man's peace has stirred something in you, perhaps a wish for quiet or for meaning, or simply for a slower kind of day, stay close to that feeling. Maybe that's your mountain calling. And if you'd like to walk further with this story, hearing where the path leads and how it ends, you can follow along, because the last part of his journey is not about leaving, but about becoming one. Silence he so deeply. In the final years of his life, the man stopped marking time, and seasons blended without beginning or end. Days passed like ripples in still water. His beard grew long and white, skin darkened from sun and smoke, his eyes clearer. He felt no fear of age, no bitterness, slow decline. He had seen how everything living in the valley aged in the same way. The trees bending, the rocks crumbling, the rivers carving new paths. To him, this change was not decay but continuity. What wore down became foundation. What ended gave shape to what began. He felt himself part of that same quiet cycle. He moved more slowly now, his steps deliberate and careful on the uneven ground. His breath came heavier in the cold mornings, but his patience never wavered. The tasks that once took an hour now took half a day. He didn't mind. The mountain had taught him long ago that nothing important happens quickly. He found joy in the smallest, striking a spark, watching, feeling the stove's warmth bloom through the cabin, hearing the first song of a bird in spring. Those moments held more meaning than years of noise ever had. One winter night, a storm came harder than any he could remember. The wind howled across the ridge with a voice that seemed almost human, a deep, roaring cry that shook the cabin's walls. Snow piled against the windows until no light remained. Inside, fire burned low, and the air grew thin. He sat close to the stove, listening, feeling the pulse of storm. He could sense its strength, the raw, wild energy that had shaped this land. And in that sound, he didn't hear threat. He heard kinship. He whispered softly, "You and I are not so different. We both move until the world tells us to rest." Chimney, his faithful companion, breathed as it always had, steady, rhythmic, drawing warmth through the room even as the wind fought to take it. He looked at it then with quiet gratitude. That crooked pipe had carried his life through every winter, had taught him patience, balance, had turned imperfection into wisdom. He reached out and touched its base, warm beneath his fingers, and smiled. The storm could do what it wanted. The fire still lived, and so did he. When morning came, the world outside was unrecognizable. The cabin was nearly buried in snow, the landscape blanketed so thickly that even the trees were asleep. He stepped outside, the air sharp and bright, the silence after the storm. Not a single sound moved through the valley. He felt small in that stillness, but not insignificant. Every breath he took turned to mist, floating briefly before fading into the cold air. Watching it disappear, he thought how simple life truly was, a brief warmth rising into an endless, and he found comfort in that thought. As days turned to weeks, the deep cold set in. His body grew weaker. Tasks that had once been routine now exhausted. He began to spend more time sitting by the fire, writing on bits of wood, scraps of bark, anything he could find. His words were simple, reflections, observations, small lessons learned in silence. He wrote of the chimney, of the storm, of the kindness, of stillness. He wrote about the way the mountain had taught him to listen, to wait, accept. And in those final writings, he spoke not to himself, but to whoever might come after, some traveler, some wanderer, maybe even someone who had never seen a mountain but felt its call inside them. He left his words hidden throughout the cabin, under the bed, behind the stove, tucked into the frame of the window. He didn't number them or sign them. He didn't want them to be read as a story, but as pieces of a voice scattered like seeds. He knew that one day the wind or time would carry them to someone who needed them. That was enough. His life had never been about being remembered. It had been about understanding. One morning, he woke to the sound of ravens calling outside the window. The air was soft, pale with the first hints of thaw. The long winter was ending. He sat up slowly, feeling the ache in his bones, the familiar weight of age. He moved to the stove, added a log, watched it catch. The chimney drew the smoke upward in its usual swirling motion. He smiled faintly and said, "You're still wiser." The warmth filled the room, and for a long while he simply sat, breathing, watching the fire, listening to the small sounds of the world continuing. He must have drifted into sleep, because when he opened his eyes again, the light changed. The cabin glowed with the gold of late afternoon. The air was still. The fire burned low but steady. He stood slowly, stepped outside one last time, and looked across the valley. The snow reflected the sun like a sea of light. He could see the ridge, the frozen creek, the thin plume of smoke from his chimney bending with the wind. He felt the mountain's breath, cold and gentle, and in that moment he felt what he had been seeking, not escape but unity. He no longer stood apart from it. He was part of it, as much as the snow, the trees, the stone beneath his feet. That evening, as darkness fell, the chimney smoke rose slower, curling softly against the twilight sky. The fire dimmed. The cabin grew quiet. The wind moved through the valley in low, steady sighs. And when morning came again, smoke no longer rose. The door stayed closed. The mountain kept it silent. Weeks later, when spring began to thaw the edges of the valley, a pair of hikers stumbled upon the cabin, covered in melting snow, the wood gray and weathered, the air inside cool and still. They stepped carefully, reverently. Everything was in its place. Tools neatly arranged, a cup beside the stove, ashes soft and white in the hearth. And there, by the window on the small table, they found a piece of bark with words carved into it. The letters were rough but clear. It said, "Do not hurry. Listen to the wind. It knows more than you think." They looked around the small room, the bent chimney, the signs of a life lived simply and well. They didn't speak for a long time. When they finally left, they carried that piece of bark with them, not as a relic, but as a reminder. They didn't know his name, but they knew his story. It lived in the smoke stains on the walls, in the worn handles of the tools, in the calmness that seemed to linger in the air. Over the years, the cabin slowly gave itself back to the mountain. The roof sagged, the walls softened, the chimney leaned a little more each season. Moss grew where hands once touched. The wind passed through the open spaces like a voice carrying a memory, and those who came upon it, travelers and wanderers and dreamers, always felt the same thing, a strange sense of peace, as if the mountain itself had once been human and remembered what that felt like. Some said they could still smell the faint scent of smoke on calm days, drifting low through the valley, curling just like it did when the man was alive. Others said they heard a voice in the wind, not words exactly, but the tone of someone who had listened so long that silence began to speak back. Whatever the truth, the mountain kept his story, just as he had kept it secret. And so his legacy was not written in books or monuments, but in warmth, in the way his chimney had taught anyone who saw it that wisdom doesn't always look clever, that sometimes the crooked thing, the strange thing, the thing the world calls foolish, is the one that works best. His life was proof that there is beauty in simplicity, purpose in stillness, and strength in surrender. Maybe that's what the mountain teaches anyone who listens long enough, that peace isn't found in changing the world, but in aligning yourself with it. The wind, the snow will still fall, the fire will still burn and fade, but somewhere between those moments, if you stay quiet enough, you can hear the same truth he did, that everything belongs exactly where it is. If you've walked with him this far, through the cold, the silent, through the smoke and the years, then you already carry part of that mountain with you. And if this story has reached some quiet corner of your own life, maybe it's there. Let it remind you to slow down, to breathe, to listen. And when you're ready, tell me what you felt, or where in the world you are hearing this from. Leave a trace as he did, so the silence can keep speaking through new voices. And if the story has warmed you even a little, share it, so that others might remember too that even in the coldest places, wisdom burns quietly.